Throughout most of my childhood, I spent a lot of time replaying a small pile of NES games. Wandering aimlessly throughout The Legend of Zelda's vast overworld, or riding the horse over and over in Bill and Ted's excellent video game adventure ate up many afternoons back then. But another game I came back to regularly was Faxanadu. It's a side-scrolling action-adventure game with some RPG elements mixed in, and it features some of the very best atmosphere and music on the NES. Apart from fighting its world's eclectic monster roster and traveling through the world tree, I passed many hours flipping through the manual and taking in every last bit of information and artwork. I fell deeply in love with adventure games with swords and shields and nameless heroes on impossible quests to save the world. There came a time later on in my life when I started thinking back on that game and wondering whether or not there were more experiences like Faxanadu out there from that generation of gaming. I sifted through as many top game articles and reviews as I could find to curate a list to play, and standing on the other side of 8 of them, I'm excited to share what I found. When I was deciding what to include on this list, the criteria were fairly strict. Games had to be mainly side-scrolling action adventures with or without RPG elements. They had to be relatively story-driven, and there had to be some NPC interactions to propel the story forward. Lastly, they had to have an overworld that could be maneuvered through freely, with backtracking available. What you won't find here are arcade-like adventures that are fractioned into stages like Kid Icarus, or games that mainly involve undirected exploration like Legacy of the Wizard. Alright, let's get going. Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link is one of the most challenging games I've ever managed to finish, and it features some of the most satisfying enemy AI to learn and overcome. You play as Link, who's tasked with bringing around Zelda from a long sleep by retrieving the third Triforce that's locked away in the Great Palace. The palace was sealed by the binding force of 6 other dungeons, and their guardians have to be defeated to unlock the path to get there. Against you are all of the minions of Ganon that are seeking to revive him, and Link's blood is the key requirement to his resurrection. The game is split into a top-down overworld and side-scrolling action, but the latter is definitely at the heart of the game. As you move around the overworld map looking for the next stopping place, monsters will spawn at random. If you touch any of them, you're thrown into battle where you'll have the option to fight the enemies that ambushed you, gaining valuable experience. After accumulating enough, you can level up either health and magic meters or attack strength, adding considerable depth to the gameplay compared to some of the other games mentioned here. You'll also gain access to a number of spells and tools, as well as several combat techniques as you advance. These are used frequently and meaningfully, making the work to acquire them feel like time well spent rather than busy work or filler. There are a couple of places where the localization feels confusing. In a world as large and vast as this, a poorly worded hint or 10 can result in some serious roadblocks if you can't make sense of what NPCs are trying to tell you. Another complicating factor is that your tools will occasionally have outside-the-box secondary functions that you may not think to try. Even still, this game really shines in its variety, especially in the complexity of the dungeons you visit. They do a fantastic job testing your adeptness in navigation and push you to use your entire skill repertoire to make it through the puzzles and obstacles that crop up. The best parts for me involve the enemy combat in these places. Every sequential dungeon is overflowing with new monsters that are significantly more threatening, as well as smarter and more adaptive than what you've seen before. You really need some fast thinking and skill to defeat them, and that same creativity you'll need to master in regular combat also extends to the bosses that you'll come up against. This is definitely one of the longer games in the group, but it's also one of the most fulfilling to beat. Lord of the Sword for the Sega Master System is one of 2 games on this list that brings with it a unique challenge. You have to finish the entire thing with the threat of limited continues hanging over you. You take up a sword and bow as a lone adventurer trying to become the next king after the previous one was murdered, and the only thing standing between you and the crown are 3 tasks that must be completed to prove your worthiness. The adventure sees you traveling and battling your way around Valginia while searching for clues to drive the quest forward. And you'll have the pleasure of rendezvousing with many people that are mostly just this one guy wearing a different colored outfit. People are either extremely helpful or full of shenanigans, so if I can offer one piece of advice, always speak to everyone multiple times. Not just twice, but many times just in case a dialogue option changes. This is something that happened regularly, and until I realized this, I wasn't able to progress for a long while at a few sticky points. While there is no experience or leveling system in Lord of the Sword, there is a gated world to explore that opens up as you find items and fulfill side quests. The combat is very short-ranged if you're using the sword, and while you do have the option to use a distance attack, the arrows are quite a bit slower to fire off. Landau almost always feels like he's moving in slow motion compared to everything else on screen, and I never got used to many of the enemy attack patterns. You do get a big health bar to burn through, but it really doesn't last that long when you're constantly being pummeled. While there is some novelty to be had here, Lord of the Sword can wear down the patience of even the most tolerant player because it inevitably starts to feel a bit monotonous, especially if you're playing without a guide. The enemy spawns are exactly the same each time you walk between towns, so if you don't really know where to go next and backtrack to the same places a lot, you'll be waltzing through the same fights repeatedly until you figure out what to do. Since there's no reward for these battles in the form of health replenishments, power-ups, or even experience, it may feel like your efforts are fruitless if you aren't making progress in a timely fashion. Even still, crossing the finish line on this one is worth the time you'll need to spend perfecting your stroll through Balginia. The Battle of Olympus has one of the most coherent localizations of any game that I've ever played from this time period, and that consequently makes this one of my favorite experiences from the NES library. The best comparison that I can make to this is Golden Axe Warrior for the Master System, and that game was made for English-speaking audiences from the get-go. It's that good. Here, you play as Orpheus from the tales of ancient Greek mythology, trying to reclaim the freedom of his wife Helen, who's been captured by Hades. Orpheus must travel to Tartarus to save her, and the trek involves tracking down 3 nymphs to help direct his journey to Hell. The navigation is a bit confusing to start, since all of the places on the map of Greece are connected via one continuous side-scrolling world. The biggest issue is finding where those connecting points are, since a door in a tree could bring you between areas just as much as the edge of a screen could. Once you get a feeling for how to move from place to place, the fun truly begins. To find the nymphs and eventually get to Tartarus, you'll have to solve a few mysteries and mazes, as well as track down a bunch of special items and upgrades for your equipment. This game is packed with secrets, and most of them are mandatory to advance. As I alluded to earlier, what to do next is always given up in plain text by someone you've spoken to, and if you keep good notes, it shouldn't be too troublesome to figure out where to go. Exploring all sorts of different environments in search of the next world-expanding object keeps the momentum rolling along. There is an intended sequence for things to be done, so while it may seem like a sprawling open world at first, it is possible to get hung up in one area until you figure out what will unlock the next leg. While there is no experience system here to speak of, the almost constant barrage of monsters can feel worth the work to murder since they regularly drop health-restoring nectar and olives, the endgame currency. Enemies and their attack patterns can be very tough to deal with. Knockback into pits causing instant death happens far too often in certain regions, and there's very little that can be done to avoid it. Lots of monsters are too short to hit with your weapon even when ducking, and the hitbox on some of the flying enemies, especially the bats, is very difficult to find. Thankfully, if you do end up dying often in combat, not all hope is lost. There are generous checkpoints in each of the areas you visit in the form of temples, with a god inside to speak to, and you'll respawn at the last one you visited when you retry or continue. A piece of advice I have if you decide to play this is to learn the difference between those two options. If I died without making any significant progress, I always chose retry to go back to my last checkpoint versus continuing, since you lose half your olives with the latter. Knowing when to use each one will save you a lot of grief and grinding, and you'll need as much help as you can get throughout this beautiful game. Castlevania II Simon's Quest has some of the best ambience on the NES because it's not every day that you get to play as a cursed character that's racing against his own death clock. You begin the game in a mostly open world in search of Dracula's body parts, which need to be destroyed to lift the curse. Once you find them, these sacks don't simply become a stagnant part of your inventory, but also double as upgrades. I thought this was a really creative substitute for the way that quest items are used in other adventures, since they all have some kind of practical use in-game, despite their cryptic manual descriptions. In addition to these, you can also buy special items from merchants that you'll find in towns interspersed between battle areas. There is a lot of information to get from townspeople, and while some of it is complete nonsense, the game's manual at least tells you that NPCs will lie on occasion. The translation isn't perfect by a long stretch, but like any other game from this generation, after investigating many leads, false or not, there's always a way forward if you search long enough for it. For me, the wandering is the best part anyway. Castlevania 2 is one of the most traditional RPGs of this bunch, with experience being accumulated through destroying monsters and collecting hearts. This incrementally lengthens Simon's health bar and makes combat feel meaningful rather than just a necessary evil. These battles are set against gorgeous backdrops that really cement the dire tones of the backstory, and they might be some of my favorite on the system. Enemy standoffs are by no means easy, especially when darkness falls, but the general flow of the game is far more focused on adventuring and figuring out puzzles than it is on battle finesse like the games that came before and after it in the series on the NES. It has a very generous live system that restores you to the moment you died, even if it happens to be in the midst of the fray that killed you in the first place. There are also unlimited continues and a password system. Character movement and control feel great and responsive, maintaining the quality from the first Castlevania game. The only complaint I have is about how some jumps are extremely difficult to make. You'll need to walk as far as possible off a block before jumping, and even then, it'll still seem like you're not going to make it. Since you lose all your hearts when you die, pits are really the biggest enemy in the game. There are a few other quirks about hearts too, like how they double as experience and currency, so if there's something really good you want to buy, you might stifle your progress while you spend out your hearts reserve for that shiny new whip or whatever has your eye. There's a lot about Simon's Quest that is irrefutably fantastic, even considering some of its oddball mechanics. With multiple endings up for grabs and one of the best soundtracks on the NES as your company, it's a worthy endeavor. Rambo has the smoothest character walk cycle I've ever seen, and if you're wondering who this guy with a little knife is supposed to be, it's the same glistening pile of muscle from the box art. I believe the plot roughly follows the second movie in the franchise, and your mission is to find and photograph prisoners of war from behind enemy lines. Obviously, this passive strategy doesn't last too long, and you're forced to start killing whatever's standing in your way. You gain experience for every foe you poke to death, but the experience system is not your typical RPG fare, since instead of increasing Rambo's general stats like strength or defense, it only levels up his knife strength. If you're wondering how experience affects the arsenal of other weapons you can eventually use, the short answer is it doesn't. There are a number of limited use ranged weapons available, and while they don't get stronger per se, they are a renewable resource that can be replenished with enemy drops. You can also permanently level up your health bar after certain battles, so it's worth leaving no enemy unslaughtered. As you play, you'll navigate through many different terrains and fight more than just droves of enemy soldiers. There will be squabbles with forest creatures, adversaries from beyond our normal human world like the undead, as well as enemy technology. The combat feels great once you get the hang of Rambo's movement pattern, but he's very committed to his jumps, making it difficult to make any subtle moves in the forward direction. I accidentally ran into enemy fire a lot because of this, but fighting with the ranged weapons helps. The biggest issue I had playing through was a navigation aspect. You move between sub-areas on these little directional squares and can then walk left or right to explore, but the trouble is that there aren't a whole lot of landmarks to orient yourself with. It makes it difficult to know when you found a new area versus endlessly looping through the same scenery, because heading in a single direction doesn't always take you forward. It can loop you back around or teleport you to somewhere different, and despite my best efforts, I couldn't figure out any sort of logic with this system. Mapping is always an option, but this was definitely one of the more confusing games to travel through on this list. If you like a little bit of story with your games, there's a loose plot holding different segments of the mission together, and even a little drama. The script is nothing to write home about, but it does give the characters a little more depth than the average. Clash at Demon Head has some of the most over-the-top and funny character interactions of this bunch, and with all of that quirkiness packed in, you'll never be able to predict what's around the next corner. That humor is set against a pretty serious backstory where you play as a successful commander named Bang, who, in the middle of his vacation, gets drawn away on a very important mission to save the world. He has to rescue an abducted professor and prevent an enemy group from blowing up Earth with a doomsday bomb. The game plays out in one huge continuous world that's segmented into different areas. To move around the map and get to the many locations, you'll have to enter side-scrolling mode and travel through the numbered routes and of course survive the trip. You can go in almost any direction from the very beginning, but like many of these gated adventures, certain events need to happen before new paths open up. If you're playing this for the first time without a guide, you'll likely spend a lot of time going wherever you feel like until you encounter someone that will give you your first directive. The people you meet in Clash at Demon Head aren't tucked away in the safety of cities, but will just be hanging out on a route somewhere instead. When you speak to them, they'll give you a clue or a tip about a route of interest, which could harbor more important people you'll need to speak to, or reveal information about where a secret might be lurking. The beginning of the game may feel a little aimless until you get a few leads, but all of that can be remedied with some good note-taking and patience. While running around from place to place, upgrades to your power meter are discovered rather than earned through the experience of battle. The many face-offs with enemies are not in vain though, because you will have to fight to make money and accumulate force points. Eating apples will add some force to your total, and these points can be used to unlock special abilities that help you on your quest. Money, on the other hand, is necessary to complete the game, since you'll need to buy what are essentially power-ups to push through obstacles that you'll encounter. In your travels, you might notice a ledge that's just out of jumping range or some water that you can't dive down into. To see where these places go, you can buy several kinds of suits from the shop, throw them on, and then do some experimenting. The suits are limited use, so if you have a hunch and end up being wrong, you'll have to buy another one to try again. Thankfully, those NPCs I mentioned earlier will direct you on where to try looking. You won't be firing in the dark very often if you heed their advice. While the overall pacing is great, there are some significant difficulty spikes, especially when it comes to boss battles. They are manageable with some of the weapons that you can purchase from the shop, but they can be frustrating. Even with a couple of tiny problems, Clash at Demon Head is a very bizarre escapade that is packed with a ton of depth that should be experienced at least once. Kenseiden for the Sega Master System has a progress arc that's built solely around learning new fighting moves to better destroy your adversaries with. You play as a samurai trying to reclaim a stolen family sword and scrolls from an enemy faction, and you have to travel around ancient Japan to locate them. The gameplay is mainly horizontal and vertical platforming, paired nicely with some surface-level exploration. Cutting your way through the eclectic enemy roster does not reward you with anything but points, but you can find stat advancement through exploration. Each province is its own separate level with a few branching paths, with some housing temporary strength boosts that will last until your next death, or other important items like the diary that will allow you to continue. Kenseiden is the other game here that pressures you to get everything done in one sitting. There are no passwords, and the threat of limited lives and continues really ramps up the difficulty. You will likely meet death often, but unfortunately it may not be the enemy combat wearing down your health meter that will force you to the game over screen. It'll be the knockback. Treacherous pits causing instant death are everywhere, and until you learn when and where monsters will appear, it's very likely that they'll push you into death's embrace more often than you'll like. There's something called continue mode mentioned in the manual's helpful hints section that permits continuing a few times without finding the diary, but it doesn't work forever. A big part of beating Kenseiden will come from memorizing the stages as well as finding the fastest path through them, which may not be as enticing as some of the other games on this list. With that said, there are ways to improve character stats, some of which will happen naturally by defeating bosses. With each scroll you recover, you learn a new fighting move, but will also sometimes see a permanent increase to strength or the length of the life bar. There are ways to stretch the health meter even further, but this involves completing training areas that are a non-stop onslaught of projectiles that have to be evaded successfully to get the reward. There are a few of these available to complete if you want to spend the time learning them. The other part to consider is that anything that you reap from them will disappear if you continue, so the time sink may or may not be worth it. Unfortunately, there are no towns with NPCs to provide hints on where to start looking for each of the bosses, but the world is small enough that it won't take you long to uncover them. They are very challenging if you try to do them out of order, and while the game does allow you to take any path you like, there is an ideal route to go that will make your progress more efficient. I was able to finish this game in a single afternoon without too much practice, and while it's not on par with some of the other longer-winded epics that we've discussed here so far, it's a great little adventure game with some interesting mechanics I haven't seen elsewhere. Rygar's exciting gameplay goes hand in hand with one of the most useful instruction manuals I've seen for the NES. It tells you everything that you need to know and more to be successful, maybe even a little too much at times depending on your own style. You play as Rygar, a warrior that's been raised from the dead as part of a legend come true. The world is being decimated by a terrible tyrant ruler named Ligar, and Rygar's the only one with the power to free the trapped Endora gods and help destroy Ligar and his minions. The side-scrolling stages are accessed through a playable top-down hub region called Garlos, but not all areas it leads to are accessible right at the start. When you track down the few doorways that you can enter, the places inside need to be thoroughly explored to find the Endora God's sacred treasures. These play a couple of different roles, but a few will open up previously unreachable sections not only in Garlos but also in the side-scrolling areas. The instruction manual is kind enough to tell you where to find the treasures, but it's possible to figure it all out on your own if you'd prefer to play it without that help. The game progress is very structured, so until you find the correct items when you're searching, you'll run into many dead ends that require one of the treasures to pass. Usually there's someone nearby to tell you what you're missing, but you'll have to leave and find that tool before you can continue forward. One of the best parts about Rygar is the scenery. You'll find yourself adventuring against the backdrops of gorgeous mountains at sunset, as well as forests and dark caves while crushing some truly abominable foes along the way. As enemies fall to the disc armor, you'll accumulate experience that levels up Rygar's overall strength and endurance. I rarely had to grind for stats and made headway by naturally feeling my way through the game. There's also a humble magic system with a couple of spells to complement what I'd consider to be some of the most fun combat from this list. You actually get to use a melee weapon with some reach for once, and paired with excellent character control, Rygar very quickly became one of my new favorite NES games. Back when I started the search for more adventures like Faxanadu, I could have only dreamed of experiences like these existing. There are probably way more of them out there, and I'm always interested to learn about 2D side-scrolling action-adventure games. If you have any recommendations for me from any generation of gaming, please feel free to let me know.